In the summer of 479 BC, a Spartan king stood before the largest Greek army ever assembled and made a promise that would echo through the ages. "We will not stop," he declared, "until Persian blood washes away the shame of Thermopylae." What happened next would become one of history's most stunning military victories, a battle so decisive it would change the course of Western civilization forever. This is the story of Plataea, the revenge of Thermopylae, where outnumbered Greek warriors faced an empire that had never known defeat on European soil. 10 months earlier, the world had watched in horror as King Leonidas and his 300 Spartans made their legendary stand at the hot gates. The narrow pass of Thermopylae ran red with blood as the greatest warriors Greece had ever produced were cut down to the last man. Their sacrifice bought time, yes, but it came at a terrible cost. The Persians swept through central Greece like a tidal wave. Athens burned. Her temples lay in ruins. Her people fled to the islands, watching smoke rise from their sacred city. The Persian king Xerxes stood in the ashes of the Acropolis and believed he had conquered Greece. He was wrong.
300 against an empire. They held the pass.
The man who would prove him wrong was Pausanias, nephew of the fallen Leonidas and regent of Sparta. At 25 years old, he carried the weight of his uncle's death on his shoulders. He had grown up hearing stories of Thermopylae, of how Leonidas had defied an empire with just 300 warriors at his back.
For Greece.
Now Pausanias commanded an army, 10,000 Spartans strong, the largest force his city had ever fielded. But even this was not enough. The Persians who remained in Greece under their General Mardonius numbered 300,000 men, perhaps more. The odds were still 30 to 1.
Lock shields! Keep the line! Eyes forward!
Yes, sir!
Spears to ground! Hold for the signal!
But numbers alone do not win wars. Pausanias knew this. Every Spartan knew this. They had been training for war since they were 7 years old, taken from their mothers and molded into living weapons. They learned to fight in the phalanx, that impenetrable wall of bronze and iron that had made Sparta feared throughout the Greek world. Each man carried a spear 9 feet long, a short sword called a xiphos at his hip, and a shield so heavy it took years to master. The shield weighed about 15 pounds of solid bronze and wood, large enough to protect not just the man who carried it, but his comrade to the left. This was the secret of the phalanx. You did not fight for yourself. You fought for the man beside you. Your shield protected him, his shield protected you. Break that trust and the phalanx collapsed. Maintain it, and you became unstoppable. The Spartans were not alone in their quest for vengeance. When Pausanias called for warriors to march against the Persians, Greece answered. From Athens came 8,000 hoplites, heavy infantry armed and armored like the Spartans themselves. These men had watched their city burn. They had lost homes, temples, families. They wanted blood. From Tegea came 1,500 warriors. From Corinth, 5,000. From Megara, 3,000. From Plataea itself, 600 men who refused to abandon their homeland. Smaller cities sent hundreds, dozens, whatever they could spare. In total, nearly 40,000 Greek hoplites assembled for battle, supported by another 35,000 light infantry, archers, slingers, and skirmishers. It was the largest Greek army in history, but it was still outnumbered by the Persians, more than 3 to 1. The Persian force was vast beyond comprehension. Mardonius commanded not just Persian troops but warriors from every corner of the empire. There were Medes with their distinctive round shields and short spears, Bactrians in leather armor reinforced with bronze scales, Indians with bamboo bows that could punch through Greek bronze at 200 paces, Thracians wielding javelins and curved swords, cavalry from the steppes of Central Asia, riders so skilled they could shoot arrows backwards at full gallop. And at the heart of the army, the immortals, the Persian king's elite guard, 10,000 strong and so named because their numbers were always maintained. When one fell, another immediately took his place. They had never been defeated in open battle. The Persians also possessed something the Greeks did not have in significant numbers: cavalry. Mardonius commanded perhaps 50,000 horsemen, a devastating force on open ground. The Greeks had perhaps 1,000 cavalry, mostly from Athens, and these were green troops with little experience. In any open field battle, the Persian cavalry would sweep around the Greek flanks and tear them apart. Pausanias knew this. He knew that to win, he had to choose the battlefield carefully, to find ground where Persian numbers and cavalry would become liabilities instead of advantages. In late August of 479 BC, the two armies converged on the small city of Plataea, nestled in the foothills between Thebes and Athens. The Persians had made their camp on the north bank of the Asopus River, a wide plain perfect for cavalry operations. Mardonius wanted to lure the Greeks into the open, to crush them with his superior numbers and horsemen. But Pausanias refused to take the bait. He positioned his army in the foothills south of the river, where rough terrain would protect his flanks and hinder Persian cavalry. For more than a week, the two armies stared at each other across the river valley. Neither commander wanted to attack uphill into a prepared enemy position. It was a deadly game of patience, and both sides knew that one mistake could cost them everything. The Greeks held the high ground, but they had a critical weakness: water. The Spartans and their allies depended on a single spring called Gargaphia for their drinking water. Mardonius recognized this vulnerability immediately. He sent his cavalry on lightning raids, not to attack the Greek army directly, but to foul the spring, to drive stakes into the muddy ground and poison the water with dead animals. It was brutal, effective psychological warfare. Within days, 70,000 Greek warriors were facing a water crisis. Men grew thirsty. Discipline wavered. Pausanias knew he had to act. On the night of September 1st, 479 BC, Pausanias made a decision that would define his legacy. He ordered a retreat under cover of darkness. The plan was to fall back to a new position with better access to water, to regroup near the city of Plataea itself. But night movements with a massive army are chaos even under the best circumstances. Units became separated. Commanders lost contact with each other. By dawn, the Greek army was scattered across miles of rolling terrain, divided into isolated groups that could be destroyed piecemeal if the Persians attacked quickly enough. Mardonius could not believe his fortune when his scouts reported the Greek withdrawal in disarray. For over a week, he had faced a unified enemy in a strong defensive position. Now they were scattered, vulnerable, their backs turned in retreat. He saw his moment. At first light, he gave the order to attack. 50,000 Persian cavalry thundered forward, followed by waves of infantry. The immortals marched in perfect formation, their spears glinting in the morning sun. Behind them came the vast mass of the Persian army, 300,000 men moving to crush the Greeks once and for all. The first Greeks to face the Persian onslaught were the Spartans and Tygians, about 16,000 men who had been slowed by their heavy armor during the night retreat. They found themselves isolated on a small ridge near the village of Hysia, with no support and an army bearing down on them like an avalanche. Pausanias ordered his men to form up, to lock shields and prepare for the storm. The Spartans moved with practiced precision, each man knowing his place, each shield overlapping with the next, until they formed a single, unbroken wall of bronze. They faced north, toward the approaching Persians, and waited. What happened next was recorded by Herodotus, the father of history, who interviewed survivors and wrote their testimony. The Persian cavalry struck first, wave after wave of horsemen charging the Spartan lines, loosing arrows and javelins. trying to break the formation before the infantry arrived. But the Spartan shields held. Arrows clattered harmlessly off bronze. Javelins stuck in the thick wood but did not penetrate. The horses, magnificent beasts trained for war, nonetheless feared the wall of spears and shields before them. They wheeled and circled, but could not break through. For hours, the cavalry assaulted the Spartan position, and for hours the Spartans held. Then came the immortals. 10,000 of Persia's finest warriors advanced in formation, their own shields locked, their spears leveled. Behind them marched tens of thousands more Persian infantry, Medes and Bactrians and warriors from a dozen conquered nations. They crashed into the Spartan lines like a hammer striking an anvil. The sound was deafening, a collision of bronze on bronze, wood splintering, men screaming. The front ranks of both armies pushed against each other with all their strength, shields grinding, spears thrusting between gaps, searching for flesh. This was the kind of warfare the Spartans had trained for their entire lives. But the Persians had numbers. For every one that fell, two more pressed forward. The battle became a grinding, bloody stalemate. Pausanias and his men fought for hours in the late summer heat, their bronze armor baking under the sun, their throats parched, their arms burning with exhaustion. Persian cavalry continued to harry their flanks, shooting arrows, looking for any weakness. And still the Spartans held. 4 miles to the east, the Athenians formed their phalanx and prepared to fight their former neighbors, Greek against Greek, in a bitter civil war within a war. They could hear the battle raging at the Spartan position, could see the dust rising from thousands of men locked in combat, but they could not help. They were fighting for their own survival. Back at the Spartan position, Pausanias realized he was losing. Not in morale or courage, his men would fight until their last breath, but in simple mathematics. The Persians were rotating fresh troops to the front, while his warriors grew more exhausted by the moment. Casualties mounted. The phalanx began to compress as men fell and the ranks tightened. If this continued, the line would eventually collapse from sheer pressure and exhaustion. He needed a miracle, or at the very least, divine favor. Pausanias did something remarkable then, something that reveals the mindset of these ancient warriors. In the middle of the most desperate battle of his life, with thousands of enemies pressing toward him, he stopped fighting and began to pray. He called out to Hera, the queen of the gods, patron of marriage and protector of heroes. He asked for her blessing, her intervention, her strength. His men saw their commander praying in the midst of battle and understood. They redoubled their efforts, pushed harder against the Persian lines, and screamed their war cry, "Allah-la-la-lai!" The sound echoed across the battlefield, a primal roar of defiance that made even the Persians hesitate. At that exact moment, the Persian General Mardonius made a fatal mistake. He had been watching the battle from horseback, directing troops, sending reinforcements to weak points in his line. Confident that his numbers would eventually overwhelm the Spartans, he rode closer to the fighting to better direct his men. He wore distinctive armor, white and gold, and rode a white horse that made him visible across the battlefield. He wanted his soldiers to see him, to draw courage from his presence. But visibility works both ways. A group of Spartans, perhaps a dozen men led by a warrior named Arimnestus, broke from the main formation and charged directly at Mardonius. It was a suicide run, an act of pure desperation or pure courage, impossible to say which. They cut through the Persian guards like a spear through cloth, their focus entirely on the white horse and the general who rode it. Arimnestus reached Mardonius first and hurled a stone, a simple rock picked up from the ground with all his strength. It struck Mardonius in the head with such force that it caved in his skull. The Persian general toppled from his horse and died in seconds, surrounded by enemies in the heart of his own army. The death of Mardonius changed everything. Persian officers saw their commander fall and panicked. Orders became confused. Units that had been pressing the Spartan line suddenly hesitated, looking for leadership that was no longer there. The Spartans sensed the change immediately. They surged forward, their spears finding gaps in the now wavering Persian formation. The immortals who had fought with such discipline for hours, began to fall back. The fallback became a retreat. The retreat became a rout. The Persian army broke. 300,000 men turned and ran, not in organized withdrawal, but in pure panic. They fled back toward their fortified camp on the north bank of the Asopus River, a wooden fortress that Mardonius had constructed weeks earlier in case of disaster. Now disaster had arrived. The Spartans and Tegeans pursued them relentlessly, killing thousands as they ran. The Greeks showed no mercy. These were the men who had burned Athens, who had desecrated their temples, who had come to enslave their people. The Greeks repaid them in blood. The Athenians, meanwhile, had broken through the Theban forces opposing them and now raced to join the pursuit. They reached the Persian camp just as the surviving Persian soldiers were streaming inside, trying to barricade themselves behind wooden walls. The camp was vast, built to house an army of hundreds of thousands, with walls 12 feet high and guard towers at regular intervals. Under normal circumstances, it would take weeks to properly siege such a fortification. But these were not normal circumstances. The Greeks were in a killing fury, and the Persians were demoralized and leaderless. The Athenians hit the camp walls like a battering ram. They brought up ladders, ropes, anything that could help them scale the defenses. The Persians rained arrows and javelins down on them, but the Greeks pressed on, driven by rage and revenge. Individual warriors performed acts of insane bravery, climbing the walls under fire, fighting hand-to-hand with defenders at the top, opening gates from the inside to let their comrades pour through. Within hours, the walls were breached. The Greeks flooded into the camp, and what followed was a massacre. The Persians fought desperately, but they were trapped with nowhere to run. The Greeks moved through the camp methodically, clearing tents and supply wagons, cutting down anyone who resisted, and many who didn't. Ancient sources claim that of the 300,000 Persian soldiers who fought at Plataea, fewer than 40,000 escaped with their lives. Modern historians debate these numbers, suggesting the actual casualty figures were probably lower, but even conservative estimates place Persian dead at over 100,000 men. It was an apocalyptic defeat, the kind that destroys armies and topples empires. The Greek casualties, by contrast, were remarkably light. Ancient sources claim fewer than 2,000 dead, including 159 Spartans, 52 Athenians, and 16 Tegeans among the hoplites. Modern scholars again urge caution with these figures. They seem almost too good to be true, but the disparity in casualties was real, regardless of exact numbers. The Greeks had achieved one of the most lopsided victories in military history. The aftermath of Plataea was brutal. The Greeks stripped the dead of armor and weapons, collected the bodies of their fallen for proper burial, and divided the spoils of the Persian camp. The treasures they found were staggering, gold and silver by the ton, fine silks and jewelry from across the Persian Empire. Mardonius's personal tent was converted into a meeting place for Greek commanders, and they held a feast there using Persian food, Persian dishes, Persian servants, a symbolic reversal of fortune that must have tasted sweeter than the finest wine. But the Greeks did not stop with mere plunder. They hunted down the Persian survivors, tracked them through the mountains and forests, showed no quarter to an enemy who had invaded their homeland and burned their cities. The Persian army that had terrorized Greece for a year simply ceased to exist. Xerxes, safe in his palace in Persia, received word of the disaster and reportedly fell into a depression so severe he never again attempted to conquer Greece. The great invasion was over. Plataea had consequences that echoed for centuries. The battle marked the end of Persian expansion into Europe. Never again would a Persian king seriously threaten the Greek mainland. The Greek city-states, having proven they could unite against a common enemy, entered a golden age of culture, philosophy, art, and democracy that would define Western civilization. The victory at Plataea, combined with the naval triumph at Salamis the year before, ensured that Greek culture rather than Persian culture would become the foundation of European identity. But we should not romanticize the Greeks too much. They were not fighting for abstract concepts like freedom or democracy, at least not entirely. The Spartans certainly were not democratic. They ruled over a massive slave population called helots, who outnumbered Spartan citizens 10 to 1 and were brutally oppressed. The Athenians, for all their democratic ideals, still excluded women, foreigners, and slaves from citizenship. These were violent, often cruel societies by modern standards, but they were also innovative, questioning, and intensely competitive in ways that pushed human achievement forward. The Battle of Plataea demonstrated the effectiveness of Greek military tactics against numerically superior foes. The phalanx formation, when properly employed on suitable terrain by well-trained troops, was nearly invincible against the looser formations used by Persian infantry. The Greek focus on heavy infantry, each man carrying 60 to 70 pounds of armor and weapons, created soldiers who could dominate close-quarters combat. The Persians relied more on archers and cavalry, devastating in open terrain but vulnerable in broken ground where horses couldn't maneuver and arrows couldn't penetrate Greek bronze. The psychological impact of Plataea on both sides cannot be overstated. For the Greeks, it validated their way of war, their culture, their belief in themselves as superior warriors. For the Persians, it shattered the myth of invincibility that had carried them through decades of conquest. The immortals, who had never known defeat, were destroyed as a fighting force at Plataea and never fully recovered their reputation. The battle became a symbol invoked by Greek orators and historians for generations as proof that free men fighting for their homes would always defeat slaves fighting for a tyrant, an oversimplification that contained a kernel of truth about motivation in warfare. Individual acts of heroism at Plataea entered Greek legend. Arimnestus, the warrior who killed Mardonius, was celebrated throughout Greece and lived to old age as a respected hero. The Spartans, who held the line for hours against impossible odds, became the standard by which all future warriors were judged. The Athenians, who stormed the Persian camp, proved that their city could produce soldiers as brave and effective as the legendary Spartans, a source of pride that fueled Athenian confidence for the next 50 years. But perhaps the most important legacy of Plataea was what it meant for the common soldier. This was not a battle won by kings and generals alone. Yes, Pausanias made crucial decisions, and yes, individual heroes like Arimnestus performed remarkable feats, but the victory belonged to tens of thousands of ordinary men who stood in the phalanx and fought. Farmers and merchants and craftsmen who put on bronze armor and picked up spears and marched to war because their cities called them. They faced an empire that stretched from India to Egypt, an army that outnumbered them 3 to 1, and they won. That knowledge that ordinary citizens could defeat professional armies through discipline and courage and unity became a cornerstone of Greek identity. The immediate aftermath of Plataea saw the surviving Persian forces flee Greece entirely. The remaining Persian garrisons in northern Greece surrendered or were overrun. The Greek cities that had sided with Persia, like Thebes, were punished severely. The Greeks went on the offensive, taking the war to Asia Minor and liberating the Greek cities along the coast of modern-day Turkey. Within a decade, the Delian League formed with Athens at its head, a military alliance that would eventually transform into the Athenian Empire. Sparta returned to its traditional isolationism, content with its reputation as the preeminent military power in Greece. The victory at Plataea also had unintended consequences. The success of Greek unity against Persia was never repeated. Within 40 years, Athens and Sparta would be at each other's throats in the Peloponnesian War, a devastating conflict that lasted nearly 30 years and destroyed the Greek world from within. The tactics that worked so well against the Persians, the heavy infantry phalanx, proved far less effective in civil war where both sides used the same methods. The golden age that Plataea helped create eventually consumed itself in internecine warfare, a tragedy made more bitter by the heights the Greeks had reached. But on that September day in 479 BC, none of that mattered. What mattered was that 10,000 Spartans and their allies had faced 300,000 Persians and emerged victorious. They had avenged Thermopylae. They had saved Greece. They had changed the world. The men who fought at Plataea went home to their cities, hung up their bronze armor, and returned to their lives as farmers and merchants. But they had done something extraordinary. They had looked at an empire that ruled half the known world and said no. They had stood their ground when every rational calculation said they should run. They had fought not just for land or glory, but for the right to live as free men in free cities. And they had won. This is the legacy of Plataea. Not just a military victory, but a demonstration that even the greatest empire can be defeated by determined people fighting for their homes. The battle inspired Alexander the Great, who led Greek armies into the heart of Persia a century and a half later and conquered the entire Persian Empire. It inspired Roman generals who studied Greek tactics and adapted them to create the legions that conquered the Mediterranean. It inspired revolutionaries throughout history who saw in the Greek victory proof that citizens could defeat tyrants, that free people had an advantage that subjects of empire did not. Modern military historians still study Plataea as a masterclass in defensive warfare. Pausanias' decision to hold the high ground, to force the Persians to attack uphill into prepared positions, to fight on terrain that nullified their cavalry advantage, these were all brilliant tactical choices. His willingness to retreat when necessary, to trade space for time, showed strategic flexibility that many ancient commanders lacked. And his psychological understanding of his own troops, knowing when to hold them back and when to unleash them, revealed leadership of the highest caliber. The weapons and armor used at Plataea represented the pinnacle of Greek military technology. The Spartan shield, the aspas, was a work of functional art. Made from layers of wood covered in bronze, it weighed about 15 pounds but could stop almost any blow or projectile. The inner surface had an arm strap in the center and a hand grip at the rim, allowing the warrior to brace it against his shoulder and control it with his forearm while keeping his hand free. This design made the shield part of the body, an extension of the warrior himself. The Greek spear, the dory, was typically 9 feet long, made from cornel wood with a bronze or iron point at one end and a bronze spike at the other. The spike served multiple purposes. It could be driven into the ground to brace the spear against cavalry charges. It could be used as a weapon if the main point broke, and it balanced the spear for throwing if necessary. In the close press of phalanx combat, the long reach of the dory gave Greek warriors a crucial advantage over enemies with shorter weapons. The xiphos, the Greek short sword, was a secondary weapon used when spears broke or the fighting became too close for spear work. About 2 feet long, double-edged and leaf-shaped, it was designed for both cutting and thrusting. Spartans were trained from childhood to use the xiphos effectively, practicing against wooden posts and eventually live opponents in supervised combat. The edge had to be sharp enough to penetrate the gaps in armor, and the point strong enough to punch through leather and light bronze. Greek armor at Plataea varied by wealth and city. The Spartans wore full bronze cuirasses, chest and back plates that covered the torso, along with greaves for the shins and often helmets with full face protection. The Corinthian helmet, most iconic of Greek military equipment, covered the entire head except for the eyes and mouth, providing excellent protection but limiting vision and hearing. Richer warriors might add thigh guards and arm guards, though these hindered movement. The total weight of a hoplite's equipment, armor, shield, spear, and sword, approached 70 pounds, an enormous burden in the heat of a Greek summer. The Persians, by contrast, favored mobility over protection. Most wore leather or linen armor, reinforced with bronze or iron scales, effective against arrows and light blows, but vulnerable to the thrust of a Greek spear. Persian shields were typically wicker or leather, much lighter than Greek bronze, but offering far less protection. The Persian spear was shorter, 6 to 7 feet, better for horseback use, but disadvantaged in the infantry press. Persian archers were justly famous, capable of shooting 15 arrows per minute at ranges exceeding 200 yards, but they needed space and time to be effective. Luxuries denied them in the chaos of Plataea. The cavalry that Mardonius commanded represented the elite of Persian military power. These were professional soldiers, often from noble families, trained from childhood to ride and shoot. They used composite bows, made from wood, horn, and sinew glued together, which were far more powerful than simple wooden bows. A skilled Persian horseman could shoot accurately at a gallop, turn in the saddle to shoot backwards, and reload while controlling his horse with his knees alone. Against infantry in the open, they were devastating. Against a prepared phalanx in broken terrain, they were much less effective. The logistics of both armies at Plataea were staggering. Feeding and supplying 75,000 Greeks for weeks required a massive effort. Each warrior needed 2 to 3 pounds of food per day, plus water, firewood, and fodder if he had horses. Multiply that by tens of thousands of men, and you understand why ancient armies rarely campaigned for more than a few months at a time. The Persians faced even greater challenges, maintaining an army 3 times larger in hostile territory, where locals destroyed or hid food supplies. Mardonius had to establish depots, organize convoys, protect supply lines from raiders, all while conducting military operations. When the Greeks destroyed his camp at Plataea, they captured months of accumulated supplies, a logistical disaster as significant as the military defeat. The human cost of Plataea went beyond battlefield casualties. Tens of thousands of Persian soldiers who survived the battle died in the retreat, hunted by Greeks attacked by local tribes, succumbing to wounds or exposure in the mountains. Thousands more were captured and sold into slavery. The women and children who had followed the Persian army, camp followers and families of soldiers, suffered terribly. Ancient warfare made little distinction between combatants and non-combatants. The Greeks at Plataea were not interested in mercy or prisoners. They wanted revenge, and they took it without hesitation. For the Greek cities that had sided with Persia, the aftermath was harsh. Thebes was besieged and forced to surrender the leaders who had collaborated with Mardonius. These men were executed publicly, their property confiscated, their families disgraced. Other pro-Persian cities faced similar retribution. The Greeks made it clear that collaboration with the invader would be punished severely, a warning that would echo through Greek politics for generations. The archaeological evidence for Plataea is limited, but telling. Excavations near the battlefield have uncovered Persian arrowheads, Greek spear points, pieces of armor, and human remains showing violent trauma. The sheer density of these finds suggests the intensity of the fighting. One particularly grim discovery was a mass grave containing over 100 skeletons, likely Persian soldiers, killed in the battle and buried hastily afterward. The bones showed evidence of terrible wounds, skulls split by sword blows, ribs punctured by spear points, limbs severed by cutting weapons. These were not clean deaths. These men died in agony, in the midst of chaos and violence that we can barely imagine from our comfortable modern perspective. The Battle of Plataea ended the Second Persian invasion of Greece, but it did not end the Greco-Persian Wars. Conflict would continue for another 30 years, mostly as naval skirmishes and Greek offensives into Asia Minor. But Persia never again attempted a major land invasion of mainland Greece. The empire turned its attention elsewhere, to internal problems and threats from other directions. Greece was left to determine its own fate, for better or worse. The memory of Plataea was preserved in multiple ways. The Greeks erected monuments on the battlefield, marking where the Spartans made their stand, where the Athenians breached the Persian camp, where Mardonius fell. These monuments became pilgrimage sites for later generations. The historian Herodotus visited Plataea while researching his histories and spoke with survivors and their children. His account written just 40 years after the battle, is our primary source for what happened. While Herodotus includes obvious legends and exaggerations, modern historians generally trust his basic narrative because he had access to eyewitness testimony. Later Greek historians, like Thucydides and Xenophon, referenced Plataea as a model of Greek military excellence. Roman historians like Plutarch wrote about the battle as an example of courage and leadership. The story of Plataea became part of the Western canon, taught in military academies, referenced by politicians and generals, held up as proof of what disciplined infantry could achieve against superior numbers. Napoleon supposedly studied the battle and praised Pausanias' tactical decisions. Modern staff colleges still use Plataea as a case study in defensive operations and force multiplication. But perhaps the most important legacy is the simplest. Plataea showed that free people fighting for their homes possess an advantage that subjects of empire do not. The Greeks at Plataea knew exactly what they were fighting for. Their cities, their families, their way of life, all hung in the balance. If they lost, everything they valued would be destroyed. That knowledge gave them strength that no amount of training or equipment could match. The Persians, for all their numbers and professional skill, were fighting for a king who sat safely in his palace thousands of miles away. When things went wrong, when their general died and the battle turned against them, they had nothing compelling them to stand and die. They ran, and that made all the difference. This is not to say that the Persians were cowards. Many fought bravely, particularly the immortals who held their ground until their position became untenable. But motivation matters in war. An army of free citizens fighting for survival is a different beast than an army of subjects fighting for conquest. The Greeks understood this instinctively, and it became a central part of their identity. For centuries afterward, Greek political thinkers like Aristotle would argue that free governments produced better soldiers than tyrannies because free men had more to lose and more reason to fight. Modern historians are more cautious about drawing such conclusions. They point out that the Persians won plenty of battles against free peoples, that motivation alone cannot overcome major disadvantages in numbers or technology, that the Greeks themselves were often divided and fought each other as viciously as they fought outside invaders. All true. But at Plataea, on that September day in 479 BC, the Greek thesis proved correct. The free men won, and the empire retreated. The revenge of Thermopylae was complete. Leonidas and his 300 had died buying time for Greece to mobilize. Pausanias and his 10,000 had avenged them in the most decisive way possible. The Spartans could hold their heads high, knowing they had fulfilled their oath to never let the sacrifice at Thermopylae go unanswered. The shield wall had held. The spears had found their mark. The enemy had broken. Sparta had proven once again that it produced the finest warriors in Greece, perhaps in the entire world. And yet, we must remember the cost. 159 Spartans died at Plataea, each one a fully trained warrior whose education had begun at age 7 and cost his city decades of investment. 159 families received the news that their sons or fathers or husbands would not be coming home. 159 places in the phalanx that would need to be filled by the next generation. Sparta, for all its military power, had a tiny population compared to other Greek cities. It could not afford heavy losses. The irony is that Sparta's very success at Plataea, and in the wider Persian wars, led indirectly to its eventual decline. The city became so focused on maintaining its military edge that it stagnated culturally and economically, eventually being overtaken by more dynamic rivals like Athens and Thebes. But these are considerations for another story. On the day after Plataea, as the Greeks moved through the ruins of the Persian camp and counted their captured treasure, they were not thinking about the future or long-term consequences. They were thinking about survival, about revenge, about the incredible fact that they were still alive while most of their enemies were dead. They were thinking about going home, about seeing their families again, about returning to normal.